The call came on a Tuesday evening, just as Alex Chen was preparing to leave his corner office at Morrison and Grant. The autumn sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting strange patterns across the case files scattered on his desk. His Aunt Janet's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "Your Uncle Robert, he's asking for you, Alex. The doctors say it won't be long now." Alex's hand tightened around his phone. Uncle Robert had been more than just a relative, he'd been the family patriarch, the man who'd helped fund Alex's law school education, who'd given him his first internship. Now cancer was stealing him away, piece by piece. "I'm on my way," Alex said, already reaching for his coat. The drive to Mount Sinai took 30 minutes, each moment weighted with memories. Alex remembered Sunday dinners at Uncle Robert's mansion, the way his uncle's booming laugh would fill the grand dining room, the pride in his eyes when Alex passed the bar exam. The family's success, their chain of luxury hotels, their real estate holdings, their charitable foundation, all traced back to Uncle Robert's business acumen. Or so they'd always believed. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before him, antiseptic and unforgiving. In room 742, Uncle Robert lay propped against stark white pillows, his once powerful frame diminished. Aunt Janet sat beside him, clutching his hand, her mascara leaving dark tracks on her cheeks. "Alex," Uncle Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "Everyone out. I need to speak with my nephew alone." Janet hesitated, then squeezed her husband's hand before leaving. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Alex alone with the steady beep of monitoring equipment and his uncle's labored breathing. "Sit down, son." Robert gestured weakly to the chair beside his bed. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've carried for too long." Alex settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair, leaning forward to catch his uncle's words. The confession that followed would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family's legacy. "The inheritance, your grandfather's estate." Robert's words came in painful gasps. "I forged the documents. Changed the will. Your father, my brother, he was supposed to inherit everything. I couldn't let him destroy what our parents built. He was too reckless, too caught up in his dreams of being an artist. I did it to protect the family fortune." The words hit Alex like physical blows. His father had died believing he'd been deliberately cut out of his parents' will, that they deemed him unworthy. The depression that followed had contributed to the car accident that claimed both his parents' lives when Alex was just 12. The original will? Alex managed to ask, his lawyer's mind already racing ahead even as his heart threatened to crack. "Hidden, in my study. Behind the Monet. The combination is. Robert's breathing grew more labored. The monitors began to chirp urgently. "Uncle Robert?" Alex reached for the call button, but his uncle's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping his wrist. "You're the only one who can make this right," Robert wheezed. "But be careful. The truth, it could destroy everything we've built. Your cousins, their livelihoods, everything depends on." His voice trailed off as his eyes fluttered closed. The room filled with medical staff, and Alex found himself pushed into the hallway. Through the window, he watched as they worked on his uncle, their movements urgent and practiced. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd just learned. His entire life, his education, his career, even his position at the firm, all of it built on a foundation of lies. The family fortune that had opened so many doors for him had been stolen from his own father. And now he alone carried the burden of this knowledge. In the waiting room, his cousins began to arrive. Mark, who ran the hotel chain. Sarah, who managed the foundation. Each of them owed their success to that stolen inheritance. Each of their lives would be upended if the truth came to light. Aunt Janet touched his arm, her eyes red-rimmed but dry now. "He's asking for everyone," she said softly. "The doctors say, they say we should say our goodbyes." As Alex followed his family back toward room 742, his uncle's final words echoed in his mind. He was the only one who could make this right. But what was right in a situation like this? And at what cost would justice come? The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical thing. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, probably the office wondering where he'd disappeared to. But that didn't matter now. Nothing mattered except the choice that lay before him: protect the family's carefully constructed life of privilege, or expose a decades-old deception that would tear them apart. As he watched his relatives gather around Uncle Robert's bed, their faces etched with genuine grief, Alex realized this was only the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. The funeral was a grand affair, exactly as Uncle Robert would have wanted. St. Patrick's Cathedral's soaring Gothic arches echoed with measured footsteps and muffled sobs as hundreds gathered to pay their respects. Alex sat in the front pew beside his cousins, the weight of his uncle's final confession pressing against his chest like a stone. Mark delivered the eulogy, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the cathedral. "Our father built more than just a business empire," he said, his words catching slightly. "He built a legacy of love, of family unity, of unwavering dedication to doing what was right." The words twisted in Alex's gut. Across the aisle, he caught his Aunt Janet watching him, her expression unreadable. Had she known? Had she been complicit in the deception that had destroyed his father's life? After the service, the family gathered at Uncle Robert's mansion for the reading of the will. Alex had been here countless times, but today the familiar surroundings felt suffocating. The Monet hung innocently on the study wall, concealing its explosive secret. Every time someone walked near it, his heart rate spiked. As the family's legal counsel, Harrison Webb, the elderly family attorney, began, "I'll keep this brief." Robert's wishes were clear and simple: the business holdings are to be divided equally among his children, with provisions for his nephew Alex to retain his position at the firm and his seat on the board. Alex barely heard the rest. His eyes kept drifting to the painting, to the slight discoloration in the wallpaper around its frame that suggested frequent handling. The original will was there, waiting. The truth that could unravel everything they'd built. Later that evening, as the guests began to leave, Alex found himself alone in the study. His fingers had just brushed the frame when Sarah's voice froze him in place. "Looking for something specific?" He turned to find his cousin watching him from the doorway, a glass of bourbon in her hand. The lamplight caught the suspicious glint in her eyes. "Just remembering," Alex managed. "Uncle Robert loved that painting." Sarah stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "You've been acting strange since that night at the hospital. What did he tell you?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Sarah had always been the most perceptive of his cousins, the one most likely to notice when something was amiss. She ran the family foundation with the same sharp attention to detail. "He was in pain, heavily medicated," Alex deflected. "Most of it didn't make sense. But something did." Sarah moved closer, studying his face. "I saw the records, Alex. The foundation's earliest funding came from liquidated assets, assets that originally belonged to your father." The revelation stunned him. "You knew?" "I suspected." She took a sip of bourbon. "The numbers never quite added up. But I told myself it didn't matter, that the good we were doing outweighed any irregularities in the past." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mark stood there, his face flushed with alcohol and grief. "What are you two whispering about?" "Nothing," Sarah said smoothly. "Just reminiscing." But Mark's eyes narrowed as they fell on the Monet. "Funny place to reminisce. Especially since Dad explicitly told me to make sure nobody touched that painting after his death." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Alex felt the weight of both his cousins' stares, each carrying its own threat. Mark, always the businessman, always protecting the bottom line. Sarah, the moral compass, but one whose needle had been compromised by years of willful ignorance. "I should go," Alex said, moving toward the door. It's been a long day. Stay. Mark's voice was quiet but firm. I think it's time we had a family discussion about loyalty. As Alex sank into one of the leather armchairs, he realized the choice he'd been wrestling with was no longer entirely his to make. The truth was already seeping out, like water finding cracks in a dam. And like a dam breaking, there would be no controlling the flood once it began. Sarah perched on the edge of the desk, her expression troubled. Whatever you're thinking of doing, Alex, remember that we're talking about more than just money here. The foundation supports dozens of charitable initiatives. Hundreds of people depend on our hotels for their livelihoods. And what about justice? The words escaped before Alex could stop them. What about what was done to my father? Mark's face darkened. Your father was a dreamer who would have squandered everything our grandparents built. Dad did what he had to do to protect the family legacy. By forging documents? By stealing what was rightfully his brother's? The words hung in the air like smoke. Mark's face went pale, then red. He told you. He told me everything. The dawn light filtered through Alex's apartment windows, casting soft shadows across the scattered photographs and documents spread across his dining room table. Each piece told a fragment of his father's story, newspaper clippings about art exhibitions, letters to galleries, and the dreams that had died with him. In one photo, his father smiled broadly, an arm around young Alex's shoulders, his other hand holding up a freshly completed painting. The memory of that day struck Alex with physical force. He remembered the smell of oil paints, the way his father's eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the warmth of his embrace. All of it had been stolen, not just the inheritance, but the chance for his father to live his passion without shame or struggle. His mother's voicemail from that final morning still lived in Alex's memory. Your father's not himself, sweetheart. This rejection from the gallery, it's hit him hard. I'm worried. Hours later, their car went off the road. The official report cited driver fatigue, but Alex now understood the deeper truth. His father had been crushed under the weight of perceived parental rejection, or rejection that had been orchestrated by his own brother. The soft knock at his door startled him from his reverie. His Aunt Janet stood in the hallway, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. May I come in? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex hesitated, then stepped aside. Janet's eyes swept over the table, taking in the evidence of his investigation. She touched one of the photographs gently, her fingers trembling. I loved your father, she said quietly. Did you know that? Before I met Robert, James and we were going to marry. But then the will was read, and everything changed. Alex sank into a chair, the weight of this new revelation threatening to overwhelm him. You chose Uncle Robert over him? I chose stability, Janet corrected, her voice carrying years of carefully contained pain. Your father was brilliant, passionate, but he lived in a world of dreams. Robert offered certainty, security. I told myself I was being practical. She gave a bitter laugh. I've spent 30 years being practical. Did you know? Alex asked. About the forged will? Janet's silence was answer enough. She moved to the window, staring out at the city below. I suspected. But by then, we were married, and I was pregnant with Mark. The foundation was just getting started, doing real good in the world. I told myself that the end justified the means. And my father? Did his suffering justify the means too? Janet turned back to him, tears streaming down her face. I visit his grave every month. Have for 30 years. Some days I bring flowers. Some days I just talk, trying to explain, trying to apologize. But how do you apologize for stealing someone's life? The raw honesty in her voice touched something deep in Alex's chest. He thought of his own compromises, the times he'd looked the other way to preserve family harmony, to protect his position in the firm. Mark and Sarah came to see me last night, Janet continued. They're scared, Alex. Everything they've built, everything they believe about themselves, it's all built on this lie. Sarah's work with the foundation, it's not just a job to her. It's redemption. And Mark? He's more like your father than he knows, desperate to prove himself worthy of a legacy he never truly earned. What am I supposed to do? Alex asked, his voice breaking. Let this lie keep destroying lives? Let my father's memory be dishonored? Janet moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Your father was an artist. He saw beauty in broken things, found ways to make them whole again. Maybe that's what you need to do now. I don't understand. The truth doesn't have to destroy us, Alex. It can set us free, all of us. But how we handle it, how we choose to move forward, that's what matters. Your cousins aren't bad people. They're just lost. Like I was. Like your uncle was. Alex stood, moving to the wall where he'd hung one of his father's paintings, a lighthouse standing firm against a stormy sea. He'd always seen it as a symbol of strength, of defiance against overwhelming odds. Now he wondered if it was also about finding a way home through the darkness. There's a board meeting tomorrow, he said slowly. Uncle Robert's successor will be chosen. Mark expects it to be him, but you have evidence that could change everything, Janet finished. The question is, what kind of change are you looking for? Destruction or transformation? Before Alex could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, need to see you. Urgent. Coming over now. Janet read the message over his shoulder, her face tightening with concern. Be careful, Alex. Sarah may seem like the compassionate one, but she's Robert's daughter. She'll do whatever it takes to protect what she believes in. As if on cue, there was another knock at the door. Alex and Janet exchanged glances, the weight of decades of secrets hanging between them. The time for hiding was over. The real question was, what would remain when all the lies were finally exposed? Sarah stood in Alex's doorway, rain dripping from her coat, her face pale in the harsh hallway light. Behind her, thunder rolled across the city skyline, an echo of the storm brewing within these walls. Janet moved instinctively toward her daughter, but Sarah took a step back, her eyes fixed on the evidence spread across Alex's table. You've been investigating us, she said softly, her voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there at the funeral. All this time, while we were grieving, you were building a case against our father. Sarah, Janet began, but her daughter cut her off with a sharp gesture. Don't, Mom. I heard you just now, every word. 30 years of visiting Uncle James's grave, carrying this secret. Sarah's composure cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. Did you ever think about what this would do to us? Your children. Alex watched the interaction, seeing for the first time how the weight of this legacy had shaped them all. Sarah, the conscience of the family, had built her entire identity around making amends for sins she hadn't even known she was carrying. I found something, Sarah continued, pulling a worn leather journal from her bag. In Dad's study, behind the painting. I got there before Mark could. Her hands shook as she held it out to Alex. It's Uncle James's journal. Dad kept it all these years. Alex took the journal reverently, opening it to find his father's familiar handwriting. Pages of dreams, sketches, and increasingly desperate entries as rejection after rejection piled up. The final entry was dated just days before the accident. Robert has everything, the family's respect, their trust, their love. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough for them? Some days I can barely look my son in the eye, knowing I've failed him. Alex deserves better than a father who can't provide for him, who can't even earn his own parents' approval. The words blurred as Alex's eyes filled with tears. Sarah moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. I always wondered why Dad was so obsessed with control, she said quietly. Why he pushed us so hard to be perfect, to never question, to always put the family's reputation first. Now I understand, he was terrified of being exposed, of losing everything he'd stolen. It wasn't just about the money, Janet added, her voice thick with emotion. Robert convinced himself he was protecting the family legacy. But in reality, he was protecting himself from his own guilt. Every success, every charitable donation, every accolade, they were all attempts at redemption. A key turned in the lock, and Mark burst in, his face thunderous. "I knew you'd be here," he snarled at Sarah. "Conspiring with the enemy." "The enemy?" Alex stood, anger finally breaking through his grief. "I'm your family, Mark. Your cousin. Your father stole my father's inheritance, drove him to his death, and you're calling me the enemy? You don't understand," Mark's voice cracked. "Dad told me everything last month. He made me promise to protect the family, to keep his secret. It was his dying wish." "His dying wish was for Alex to make things right," Janet corrected gently. "He told me that night in the hospital, after all of you had left. He was tired of carrying this burden, tired of the guilt eating away at him." "And what about my burden?" Mark demanded, tears streaming down his face. "Do you know what it's like to learn that your whole life is built on a lie? That every success, every achievement, was paid for with stolen money? That your own father was a—" He choked on the word. "A thief?" Sarah finished quietly. "A forger? A man who destroyed his own brother's life." She moved to stand beside Alex. "We can't change what Dad did, Mark. But we can choose how we respond to it." Mark's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "The board meeting tomorrow, they're expecting me to take Dad's place. To carry on his legacy." He laughed bitterly. "What legacy? Lies? Betrayal?" "No," Alex said firmly, surprising himself. "Not lies. Not anymore." He picked up his father's journal, turning to a page filled with vibrant sketches of the family together, Robert and James as young boys, playing in their parents' garden. "This is our legacy. Before the money, before the betrayal. Two brothers who loved each other, a family that stuck together through everything." "What are you suggesting?" Mark asked warily. "The truth doesn't have to destroy us," Alex said, echoing Janet's earlier words. "But hiding it will. Look what it did to Uncle Robert, to my father. Look what it's doing to us now." Sarah moved to the table, gathering the scattered documents. "We can make this right. The foundation, the hotels, they're doing good work. We can restructure, create a trust in Uncle James's name. Use the profits to fund arts programs, support struggling artists. Turn our shame into something meaningful," Janet finished softly. The four of them stood in silence, the weight of possibility hanging in the air. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, the first rays of sunset breaking through the clouds. But the real storm was yet to come. Tomorrow's board meeting would change everything, for better or worse. Alex looked at his cousins, at his aunt, seeing not enemies or conspirators, but wounded people trying to find their way through the darkness. The truth had the power to destroy them, yes. But it also had the power to set them free. Dawn broke over the city as Alex stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers. His father's journal lay open on the counter, the pages worn soft with years of handling. He'd spent the night reading every entry, tracking the slow erosion of his father's spirit through increasingly desperate words. But it was the sketches that haunted him most, vivid scenes of family life, moments of joy and connection that had slowly slipped away. The board meeting would start in 2 hours. In his briefcase, he carried enough evidence to shatter the carefully constructed facade of the Chin family empire. But he also carried something else, a proposal that could transform their legacy of lies into something healing, something true. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, "Ready when you are. Whatever happens today, we face it together." The night had changed them all. After Mark's breakdown, they'd talked until sunrise, really talked, for the first time in years. Janet had shared stories about James and Robert as young men, their dreams, their competitions, their deep bond that had twisted into something destructive. Mark had confessed his own struggles living under Robert's impossible expectations, the constant fear of failure that drove him to mirror his father's ruthless business tactics. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Janet, looking elegant but tired in her charcoal suit. "I couldn't sleep," she said, stepping inside. "I kept thinking about that last conversation with James, the day before the accident. He asked me if I ever wondered about the road not taken." Her voice caught. "I was too much of a coward to answer him then. But I've wondered every day since." Alex touched her arm gently. "You're not a coward now. Being here, supporting this, it takes real courage. I should have had that courage 30 years ago." Janet moved to the window, watching the city come alive below. "But we can't change the past, can we? We can only choose how we move forward." The drive to the office was silent, heavy with anticipation. In the lobby, they met Sarah and Mark. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed but determined. Mark looked like he hadn't slept at all, but there was a new steadiness in his gaze. "The board members are already arriving," he said quietly. "Dad's old partners, people who've known our family for decades. They trust us, believe in us." He swallowed hard. "We're about to destroy that trust." "No," Alex corrected gently. "We're about to earn it. Really earn it, for the first time." The elevator ride to the top floor was tense with unspoken emotions. As they stepped into the executive suite, Alex caught sight of his father's last painting, the one Uncle Robert had purchased and hung prominently in the reception area, a sunrise breaking through storm clouds, hope emerging from darkness. He'd never understood its placement until now. The boardroom was full when they entered. 12 faces turned to watch them, expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity. These were people who'd worked alongside Robert Chen for decades, who'd helped build the empire that now teetered on the edge of revelation. Harrison Webb, the family attorney, stood to begin the meeting, but Alex stepped forward. "Before we proceed with the succession vote," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "there's something the family needs to share with the board." He opened his briefcase, removing first the original will, then his father's journal, and finally the proposal they'd spent the night crafting. Sarah moved to stand beside him, then Mark, then Janet. United, for the first time, in truth. 30 years ago, Alex began, a choice was made that changed the course of our family forever. Today, we make another choice. Not out of fear or guilt, but out of love, for each other, for the legacy we want to build, for the healing we all need. The room was absolutely silent as he began to speak, laying bare the decades of deception while outlining their vision for transformation. He watched the shock, the disbelief, the disappointment play across familiar faces. But he also saw something else beginning to emerge: respect. Understanding. Perhaps even admiration for their courage in facing this truth together. Mark's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. Sarah's fingers intertwined with his free hand. Janet stood straight and proud, tears streaming down her face, finally free of the burden she'd carried for so long. The storm was breaking, but they would weather it together. And in its wake, something new would grow, something built not on lies and fear, but on truth and love and the courage to begin again. The transformation of the Chen family legacy unfolded not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of truth and reconciliation. 6 months after the board meeting that had changed everything, Alex stood in the newly established James Chen Art Gallery, surrounded by his father's work. Each painting told a story, not just of artistic vision, but of a man who had never stopped loving his family, even when that love was met with betrayal. The gallery opening was set for tomorrow, but tonight belonged to family. Sarah stood before a particularly striking canvas, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The painting showed two young brothers playing chess in a sun-drenched room, their faces alight with shared joy. "I found the photo this was based on," she said softly as Alex joined her. "Dad and Uncle James, the summer before everything fell apart. They looked so happy, so innocent." The restructuring of the Qin Empire had been painful but necessary. The truth had cost them some board members, some business partners, some of the shallow friendships that had surrounded them in their years of privilege. But what remained was stronger, more authentic, built on a foundation of honesty and shared purpose. Mark approached, looking more at peace than Alex had ever seen him. The past months had changed him profoundly. After stepping down as CEO, he'd thrown himself into the foundation's new arts initiative, discovering a passion for nurturing creative talent that would have made his Uncle James proud. "The scholarship committee met today," Mark said, his voice warm with quiet satisfaction. "We've selected our first group of recipients. 20 young artists who couldn't afford art school otherwise. Each one reminds me a little bit of Uncle James." Janet emerged from the gallery office, carrying a leather-bound book. "I found more of his journals," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Love letters he wrote me that he never sent, sketches of the life he imagined we might have had." She touched the book gently. "I think it's time these belong to you, Alex. Your father's dreams shouldn't live in darkness anymore." The sound of children's laughter drew their attention to the gallery's educational space, where Sarah's daughter Emily was teaching a group of local kids how to paint. The art therapy program had been her idea, a way to help children process trauma and find their voice through creativity. The walls were covered with their artwork, bright splashes of hope and healing. "Dad would have loved this," Sarah whispered, watching the children work. "Not the hotels or the business empire, this. Art bringing people together, healing old wounds, creating something new." The soft chime of a glass being tapped drew everyone's attention. Harrison Webb, who had chosen to stand by the family through their transformation, raised his glass in a quiet toast. "To James Chen," he said solemnly. "Artist, dreamer, beloved brother and father. And to the truth that sets us free." As the small group lifted their glasses, Alex felt a presence beside him. Mark's wife Claire had arrived with their teenage son Robert, named for his grandfather but growing into his own person, free from the weight of lies and expectations. "I've been thinking," young Robert said, his voice carrying the earnest enthusiasm of youth. "Maybe I could take some art classes. I found these old sketchbooks in my room, and something just clicked." Mark's eyes met Alex's over his son's head, both men recognizing the circle completing itself. The healing moving forward into the next generation. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Alex sat alone in the gallery. His father's journal lay open in his lap, turned to one of the final entries. "Perhaps the greatest art is not what we create on canvas, but what we create in life, the connections we forge, the love we share, the truth we dare to speak. Even in darkness, there is always the possibility of light." The morning sun began to peek through the gallery windows, casting long shadows across the paintings. In a few hours, the doors would open to the public, sharing James Chen's vision with the world at last. But more than that, sharing the story of a family that had found the courage to face its darkest truths and emerge stronger, more whole. Alex touched the journal one last time before placing it in the display case, not hidden behind a painting this time, but displayed proudly alongside his father's work. The truth had not destroyed them as Uncle Robert had feared. Instead, it had transformed them, teaching them that real legacy is not measured in money or power, but in the courage to love, to forgive, and to begin again. As he prepared to leave, Alex paused before his father's final painting, the lighthouse standing firm against the storm. But now he saw it differently. It wasn't just about defiance against the darkness. It was about guiding others home, about standing as a beacon of truth and hope for those still lost in their own storms. The Chin family's story would always carry the scars of past betrayals, but those scars had become part of their strength. In choosing truth over lies, Healing over hiding, love over fear, they had finally created a legacy worthy of passing on, one built not on stolen inheritance, but on the priceless gift of authentic connection and the courage to face tomorrow together.